Women's football, particularly in England, has risen in popularity over the last 12 months to 2 years. But what opportunities and challenges does the women's game face, particularly in the English game? How will the future of the sport look in the context of a reliance or an independence from the men's game? And what can be done to encourage equality between men's and women's football? These are all topics that we're going to cover in this week's video. My name's Neil Wood and I'm a football finance professional. This channel is dedicated to teaching you about finance through the medium of football. If that's a topic that you're interested in, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, leave a comment below and share with your friends. Since the England women's team won Euro 2022, we've seen a substantial rise in the popularity of the sport, particularly in England. Female football players are now celebrities in their own right, appearing on TV, have huge social media followings and sponsorship deals independent of their male counterparts. All this is fantastic for women's football, but how does it compare to the men's game and what can be done to improve the game even further? If we look at the most popular female footballer, Alicia Lehmann, in terms of social media following, the figures are quite impressive. If we take a comparison to Jack Grealish, an England international and Premier League winner and Manchester City regular. He's seen to be one of the most successful male footballers. But Alicia, with 8.3 million followers on TikTok versus Jack's 4.6 million and 13.2 on Instagram versus Jack's 6.8, she's got almost double Jack Grealish's following on Instagram. In comparison to the most followed male athlete in the world of football, Cristiano Ronaldo, Alicia Lehmann's figures are still quite negligible. On Instagram alone, Cristiano Ronaldo has over 484 million followers to date, and that figure will continue to increase. And Cristiano's influence on the game and the clubs that he plays for allows him to attract audiences which command the attention of sponsors around the world. That's something that female athletes can aspire to, and it's a way that you can support the female game. Following female football players is something that you can do for free, and it will help to solidify the women's game as an independent sport away from their male counterparts. But when it comes to the sport as a whole, women's football attendances have grown 600% in the last 5 years if we exclude the COVID years. I don't care who or what we're talking about, that growth is phenomenal. But what can be done to support those attendances? On the back of the success, as we mentioned, of the England national team in Euro 22, the women's football game has really kicked off. But what's holding the female game back? First of all, let's look at infrastructure. The lack of high quality independent stadia with good facilities for fans is a limiting factor for the female game. There's an obvious replacement to the lack of infrastructure in the female game with a shared resource from their male counterparts where they are available. But that excludes some independent teams. If we compare Manchester City versus Manchester United, we have the Academy Stadium at Manchester City with a capacity of 7,000 and Leigh Sports Village, where Manchester United women's team play, with a capacity of 12,000. Both excellent in terms of the women's game, but nothing in comparison to the Etihad Stadium at 55,000 capacity and Old Trafford at 74,000. Female Manchester derbies have been played at the Etihad and Old Trafford to substantial crowds, but we're still not talking these figures on a regular basis. And that's the problem with the women's game at present. Big games can attract big audiences, but the reality is that the majority of fans will still prioritise the male sport over the female if they were given the option on one specific day. There is obviously a potential fixture clash and a logistical nightmare to consider when Premier League games and Women's Super League games, which is the women's equivalent of the Premier League, would come together on a specific day. And managing the whole season to coordinate a transition between male and female games on a week in, week out basis is not going to be easy. So what's the answer? Sharing facilities with male counterparts or having separate upgraded facilities that are dedicated to women's football? Leave your comments below. Investment in women's football infrastructure, both from training facilities and stadia, is going to be key. And this is something that's being encouraged in the men's game through UEFA Financial Fair Play and the Premier League Financial Fair Play submissions, with relief being given to any investment in the future of the game. Now, the rules in the Women's Super League are not as restrictive as those in the Premier League or even at UEFA level. From the women's perspective, there is a salary cap. which is set at 40% of turnover. Now this is what's known as a soft salary cap, because turnover is quite flexible. Turnover will include contributions made from parent companies or even sister companies. Those sister companies being the male counterpart legal entities that are encouraged to invest in the women's game as well as infrastructure. These amounts being relievable from FFP calculations and do not count towards the cost of that break-even or football earnings calculation, or even a profitability and sustainability calculation when it comes to the Premier League's point of view. But what about governance in the game of women's football? The WSL, or Women's Super League, the equivalent of the Premier League, is currently administered by the FA. And now that's different to the men's game. The Premier League is a separate legal entity and a very successful commercial entity in its own right. And the only way for the Women's Super League and potentially the Championship, the division below the Women's Super League, to break away from the FA and become an independent body that can stand on its own 2 feet is through investment. And that requires financial backing. And the WSL isn't short of offers, but the FA has declined those offers to date, with a view that separating the head from the body will not be good for the game of women's football overall. Now, what does that mean? It means that the elite will get the investment and leave the grassroots game behind. The grassroots game in men's football is excellent in England. By far and away the best sport that we have in the country that allows players to progress through a school system and through a community club angle all the way through to the professional league. It's a shining example when it comes to the success stories. There are a whole host of failures that we don't get to hear about, but that grassroots system definitely works, although the FA wants to improve it on a continual basis, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the Women's Super League and the FA are very conscious of not breaking away the elite from the grassroots element of women's football. And that, in our view, is the right decision. They could pump the elite game full of cash, whether that comes from a loan from private equity firms or investment. It doesn't matter. From a commercial perspective, the game is very attractive. And it's growing. And any entity with high growth potential will attract investment. But that investment needs to be spent in the right way. And it needs to first of all be accepted. And the FA believe that financial sustainability is the way forward before that investment will come. It's likely that we'll have to see another broadcasting cycle in 1 or 2 years' time before the investment will take place. And it's inevitable that eventually the Women's Super League and the Championship will break away from the FA. That's exactly the model that we've got in the Premier League. But in the meantime, the women's game may become reliant on funding from the men's game, because the men's game is being encouraged to continually invest in women's football. And rightly so, but there's a balance to be had. As much as the men's game is now largely reliant on rich benefactors and shareholders, there is a risk that the women's game becomes reliant on their male counterparts and is unable to stand on their own 2 feet. So a financially sustainable women's game with reliance on the men's game is quite frankly not an independent sport. So the growth of the women's game needs to consider effectively weaning itself off the investment from the men's game over time. As much as there is a risk of over-reliance on the men's game, this also presents an opportunity, with cash funding the wages and the infrastructure costs and transfer fees in the women's game. The women's game isn't quite at the dizzying heights of the men's game when it comes to transactions from a player trading perspective. The January's transfer window saw a record £400,000 being transferred for Kira Walsh's move to Barcelona. That's nothing in comparison to the men's game. It's rumoured that in summer we'll see £1 million transaction in the women's game, which would be groundbreaking, but still nothing in comparison to the men. When it comes to revenue streams and costs of the football clubs from a women's versus men's perspective, it's exactly the same. The accounting treatment is going to be the same. The cost of player acquisitions will need to be amortized over a player's contract with a residual value of 0 at the end of the contract, because the player will be able to walk away for free. Since there is separation from a legal entity perspective between the women's and men's game, there is potential there for collaboration. A multi-club model for every club that has a women's operation, and one that presents an opportunity for any club to get involved in, at least where there is a male counterpart. This may leave independent women's football clubs behind, And that again poses a risk. So we can see a delicate balance between risks and opportunities for the future of women's football. The other complexity on the international stage is FIFA's World Cup broadcasting rights, particularly in Europe. There's a potential blackout on its way for women's football, simply because the upcoming Women's World Cup will be hosted in the Southern Hemisphere in Australia and New Zealand. And European broadcasting companies do not want to overpay for rights which will not attract audiences in Europe. It's not because the product isn't something that European audiences want to consume, it's simply because of time zone differences and optimizing those audience viewing figures. Broadcasters need to turn a profit as much as the next company. And at present, it looks as though FIFA is trying to bully broadcasters to overpay. But again, this is a challenge posed to not just the women's game, but would be to the men's, albeit the men's popularity would continue to outweigh that of the women's game when it comes to the World Cup at present. So as you can see, plenty of opportunities and risks when it comes to women's football. What are your thoughts on the women's game in comparison to the men's? Can you see similarities in the growth and potential future of the game? And is it a good thing that the women's game risks being consumed by money in commercial deals? Leave your thoughts and comments below. If you like the video, hit like and subscribe for more football finance content. My name's Neil Wood and I'm a football finance professional. Thanks for watching.